Bees are so fascinating. When you first go into a beehive, you're like worried about getting stung. And then as soon as you start watching them and seeing them on the combs, communicating with each other, it's just so fascinating, so complex. And it mostly works until we get in the way of it.
Populations of honeybees are dying at levels that are unprecedented and very concerning. Close to half of the colonies in the U.S. dying every single year.
Native pollinators have disappeared, and farming has become a lot bigger, and so due to all this, now they need beekeepers that can move bees from one place to the other.
We can learn a good deal from bees about the health of the landscapes that we inhabit, and we can learn a good deal about the folly of setting up our agriculture in quite the way that we have.
Agriculture is an interruption of a natural system, but it can be done thoughtfully as an interruption of a natural system with great benefits.
It's going to take 20, 30 years for that ground to get back in the shape it was to sustain life for all these wild insects, birds, and fowl, and everything else.
Protecting the land around us, protecting the soil under us is really our obligation. And from that, we get delicious, nourishing products.
We've been pollinating fruits and vegetables and nuts since the 70s, 60s, 50s. And we haven't had these kind of losses. We're not bad beekeepers, we're just trying to hang on to our business.
Hi, this is Kim Eierman from EcoBeneficial, bringing you more useful tips to help improve our environment. I have the awesome pleasure today of introducing Peter Nelson. Now, Peter is the director and cinematographer of this unbelievably terrific new documentary film called The Pollinators. I've seen it, so I can say that. And Peter, along with Sally Roy, the executive producer, have created a documentary that I want you to see. So, Peter, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, hi, Kim. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Love what you do.
Well, thank you. So this is a documentary film about honeybees and essentially their critical importance to our food system, right?
Yes, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you came to make the film and what it's about.
Well, I start off with the fact that I'm a beekeeper, and I've been a beekeeper for about 30 years, a little over 30 years. But I'm also a cinematographer, is kind of my day job, if you will. And so I got very interested in this idea of bees and our food system. And I recognized that so many people don't realize the critical importance of honeybees to our food system, and so many people don't realize how many bees are actually moved around the country all the time. Like billions of honeybees are moved, millions of hives moved around the country throughout the year, because most of it is done at night, and it's in mostly remote places, but they're absolutely essential to our agricultural system. And I got really interested in that kind of connection that many people didn't kind of understand completely, and coupled with the fact that these bee losses that these commercial beekeepers are facing and backyard beekeepers are facing is so high, 40% is not uncommon, that this is really a system that is very fragile and in peril. And so that was sort of the starting point for me, and then it's just been an unbelievable adventure since then.
Now, let me just focus on that number, 40% loss, because I've seen some surveys over time that indicate that, for example, backyard beekeepers or serious hobbyists might be willing to tolerate a threshold of colony loss of 18, 19%. Is that kind of what you hear?
Yeah, it depends on the area. A lot of it depends the statewide. Different states have different losses, and historically losses had been somewhere around 10%. And this would be going back into the 80s and back in that era. 10% loss is something that I think a beekeeper can manage, because you can split, reproduce your hives. But if you're doing this for a living and you get up around 30%, 40%, and sometimes higher, up to 50%, then I'm not an economist, but when you have a 50% loss, you're dealing in a threshold that is not sustainable, and so that's a real problem.
So what you're saying is that the beekeepers that you've interviewed, they kind of look back at these historic numbers of a 10% loss, and they're now facing a 40% loss, which clearly is not sustainable.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's devastating because most often these are family businesses, multi-generational businesses, and so you're dealing. And there aren't that many of them. There are a couple of thousand of these commercial beekeepers that move the majority of our bees around. There, over 1,200 hives, I think, is kind of the threshold for what a commercial beekeeper is considered, as opposed to a sideliner, which is less than that. And then there's backyard folks like me who just have 1 to 10 hives in their backyards.
So a commercial beekeeper has at least 1,200 hives.
That's roughly it. Yeah.
Okay, and in your film, you show these amazing tractor trailers just full of hives being driven from here to there to do pollination services. It's astounding, with literally millions of bees on them, right?
Oh yeah. A semi truck, will hold somewhere around 400, 430 hives of bees, colonies of bees, and they're all palletized, meaning that there are 4 hives or 6 hives on a pallet, and so they unload them with a forklift or something like that, specialized equipment, and they put them down in the orchards or the fields where they need the pollination, and so they're all covered with a net when they're on the truck, and so they're moved around at night because the bees are going to be in the hive, and they're moved around across the country, and just to be there to time just before the particular crop will come into bloom, so the bees will come out, they'll start to do their scouting and foraging and pollinate that crop. And so for the farmers, it's kind of a sort of an insurance policy that they have. They'll guarantee that the pollination happens, because if there's no pollination, there's no crop. And so it's important to them. And with the decline of the problems of native bees, they can't guarantee that could happen, which is also goes along with the fact that agriculture has gotten exponentially bigger and more monoculture, monocrop crops, so there's less diversity among pollinators and less habitat for pollinators. So these things are kind of like all conspiring, if you will, to require that these beekeepers move the bees around like this. And an important thing is that these beekeepers, they're doing this because of the changes in agriculture.
Right.
And it's not because the beekeepers want to get in the truck and drive their bees across the country. It's a business for them, but it really is the changes in agriculture that have driven this change and explosion of commercial beekeeping operations. And
so I would argue that your film is not just about honeybees and honeybee pollination, but really asks a bigger question about our agricultural systems and are they sustainable?
Oh, totally, yeah, and that was really one of my goals was to it's an important subject that a lot of people don't know or know that they need to know, and so we wanted to try and connect people to the food that they eat. And when you sit down and you eat, it's like 1 out of every 3 bites of food is something that's pollinated by an insect, and particularly bees do most of that pollination. So it's a really important story that affects every one of us, assuming that you like to eat.
Yeah, most of us do.
Yeah.
And you've got a fascinating group of people that you interview throughout the film, and I just want to mention that your film is now being shown at film festivals all over the country and actually internationally. You've participated in literally dozens of film festivals, or will be doing. Is that right?
Yeah. We started out. We released the film in film festivals. Our first festival was Big Sky Film Festival in February of this year out in Montana, and since then we've been in over a dozen festivals, and we have another dozen or so scheduled through the end of the year and already into next year, which is great because people are really responding to this story. It's amazing because people would say, "I had no idea that they move bees around like this and why they move bees around like that." So it's really wonderful to be able to share that story with people.
And apparently you did something pretty good because you've won 5 awards already.
Yeah. We've had a great time with it. We've won a couple of environmental awards, which is great, and then an audience award, a cinematography award, which makes me very happy, and then a best feature length documentary at a film festival just last month, which is it's very exciting. It's great we really want to get the film out there so people can see it. We love the awards, but just people's response to it and being interested in seeing is the real reward for us.
And if folks would like to know if your film is showing at a film festival near them, they can go on your website, which is www.thepollinators.net.
Correct.
And stay tuned. The other thing that you're doing, which I think is kind of interesting, is you have an arrangement with DemandFilms so people can request a screening. Explain how that works.
Yeah, it's kind of a different model it's hard for many small documentaries, which we are. We're a real independent documentary, and it's hard for many documentaries to get into theaters. And we were approached by DemandFilm, and what they do is sort of an interesting model of sort of crowdsourcing. So people can request a screening in their community. They go to DemandFilm, the Pollinators. They can request or be notified of when a screening would happen near them, and so it becomes an event, like a single day event, rather than trying to get this little documentary into a theater in New York or a theater in Los Angeles for a week, and the pressure that's there. The DemandFilms works with these theater chains, but they also work with independent cinemas, and so people can request a screening in their community, which is fantastic for us because there's so many different communities that are interested in the subject. Beekeepers are obviously them, but also gardeners. We've gotten a tremendous response from the gardening community about this film, environmental organizations and food people and agriculture people. So all of those sort of demographics, if you will, or audiences, are people that you can request a screening with your garden club or your bee club or your farming group or whatever, and bring it to your community. It's a little different in the sense that every screening has to have a threshold of seats that have to be purchased in advance, although they don't charge people for their seats until that threshold is met. And so then it's a matter of then the screening will happen, and people can go to it. So it's an interesting model. It's a little different form of theatrical distribution for an independent documentary film, but it's really working, I think, so well for us in this topic.
So if listeners are interested in requesting a screening, they go right to your website, thepollinators.net, and do so.
Yep.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the details of the film, because I found it so impactful. It was interesting, informative, and I will admit, at times a little depressing.
Yeah.
You interview a lot of interesting folks. Talk a little bit about, the flow of the film and what it explores.
Yeah, so what I did was I started with the biggest pollination event in the world, which is the almond pollination in California. And so we went out there, which starts in February, and which is just massive because they bring in a couple of million hives of bees for strictly the almond pollination, and they're there for 5-6 weeks, and then they get pulled out and they go to they start the journey throughout the year to pollinate different crops, whether it's up the west coast to do apples, cherries, and citrus, or back east to start on blueberries, cranberries, apples, and the Midwest. And so we started this sort of a journey with these beekeepers, and I meet up with them in different places throughout the year, different crops, and we use that journey as a way to talk about the problems that bees are facing, the problems that farmers are facing, and the importance upon these bees to our food system. And there's unfortunately there's not one thing that is killing the bees, and a lot of people think that, what is it killing the bees? Well, it's a combination of things, and so we go into the details about how to about the things that are a real problem for bees, and try and connect the dots for the audience about the importance ultimately to our food.
Mm-hmm. Now, not only are the beekeepers interviewed, but you've got some other interesting folks. Tell us who some of those people are. Some are quite well known.
Yeah, in addition to the beekeepers, and we have exceptional beekeepers, Dave and Davey Hackenberg out of Pennsylvania, but also Brett A.D. Out of South Dakota and California, and Glenn Card out of Billerica, Massachusetts. We also have Bill McKibben, the environmentalist and author, and Chef Dan Barber from Stone Barns and Blue Hill in New York and Westchester County. Mm-hmm. But we also have some great experts in the bee field, Dr. Jeff Pettis, Dr. Sam Ramsey, Dr. James Fraser, Marianne Fraser. So we have an interesting group of bee experts that can give context onto the science of what is happening, but also the sociological events that are associated with beekeeping. So it's kind of, we want to connect all these pieces together and try and weave a fabric that makes it clear to people about how important it is.
I actually felt exhausted watching the beekeepers in action with these, midnight runs with tractor trailers unloading, and what was most disturbing to me was the fact that some of the fields where bees were being released had been sprayed in the recent past without really any kind of disclosure to the beekeepers.
Yeah, it's one of the big problems that beekeepers face is the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, and importantly, a combination of those things together. And so in these large agricultural areas, Central Valley, California, or even in New York State, where I'm from, is that there are farms, but bees fly, and so
right.
they get involved in things that are they might come in contact with a pesticide that a neighboring farmer has sprayed, or a growth regulator, or a fungicide that another farmer or orchard owner has sprayed, not knowing that their neighbor has bees. Or bees still in pollinating. And so that's the kind of the collision that happens regularly, unfortunately, for the beekeepers. And some of it is accidental, some of it is might be careless, some of it is just, the farmers are under tremendous pressure to handle their crops well and ensure that they have a crop. And so maybe the fact that there might be bees next door is not their first thought.
It's terrifying, actually.
Yeah, it is, and it's as a backyard beekeeper, and when I saw this, we saw it in the film a couple of times. It made me literally sick to my stomach to see bees rolling out of the front of a hive dying, and I've seen it in my bees, and it's just a helpless, aggravating feeling that it's kind of hard to describe. You just cannot do anything about it.
Well, the quality of photography of the film, if I may say so, is just exceptional, and it's particularly impactful when you see, exactly as you described, bees like dropping dead and just littering the ground as the beekeepers are trying to collect their bees to take the next journey to the next farm. Yeah. If that doesn't get people, I don't know what will.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's, one of the other goals that, as a beekeeper myself and as a cinematographer, I'm fascinated by bees and most insects, but I'm particularly fascinated by bees. And I really wanted to try and show the bees in a different way, and as not a stinging insect, but as an incredibly interesting, complex social insect that we can actually learn something from. I think there's a reason why bees and beehives are used as a metaphor and an inspiration in business and many other things, is because there is something that we can learn about getting along together, about working together, and as a group. And it's just, I wanted to try and portray the bees as these fascinating little creatures that are approachable and not something to be afraid of.
And kind of, helpless and vulnerable to some degree, because they have no say over where they're going and what they're going into.
That's totally right. And so they get moved around, and when bees get moved into an orchard at night, the next morning they'll come out and they will go out and they'll forage in that area where they are. They'll send out scout bees to determine what nectar is available, what pollen is available, so they can bring back to their hive. And so they are kind of thrown into situations that, depending on what the neighbors do, may or may not be good for them. But it's also important to know that native bees cannot get moved. And so right. they have the same pressures almost in, if somebody's spraying, it's killing native bees.
Right.
And if you're doing a monoculture and don't have that diversity in forage, then native bees won't even be able to survive there. So having that diversity is a really, really, really essential component in not only a better life for honeybees, but a better life for all the native bees we have. And we have about 4,000 native bees in North America. So it's a big number of critters.
And let's face it, there is a competition for floral resources between non-native honeybees and our native species. So in terms of really kind of thinking about the future, really encouraging fewer monoculture agricultural practices and really ramping up diversity of resources, and of course skipping the pesticides.
Yeah, totally. You nailed it. I mean, it's really is, having these, because the honeybees are not native to North America. They came over with the first settlers, but they are ubiquitous here now, and our agriculture depends upon them.
Yeah, they've been here 400 years so far.
Yeah, exactly right. But I believe that they can coexist with native bees really well, and there's so many opportunities to create new habitat that is attractive to both honeybees and native bees, and that's kind of the place I'm coming from, is that I think we can create a better environment through our gardens, through our agriculture, that can support both of them, because it's dangerous to have just one species doing anything, and B, we should create a more diverse environment that is better for our native bees, but also our native birds and native all the creatures that go, these ecosystems that are limited by having singular crops.
So, Peter, as you were making the film, were there any things that the people that you interviewed said that surprised you and was new information to you that you just were maybe taken aback by?
Well, yeah, one of the things was actually a concept known as a precautionary principle. And this was something I came up in research on the film, but had a couple of people in the film talk about it, Jim Frazier in particular. And that's basically the idea that the way that they handle the subject of chemicals in the environment in Europe, for example, European Union, is they operate under the precautionary principle, which means that they have to test extensively the chemical before it goes into the environment to make sure that it's safe. And that's something that is not exactly done in that order here in the U.S. And I think that's something that could really be improved upon, because here they do conditional registration of pesticides, where the manufacturer are allowed to put them out based on their own data and test, but it's their test and their data, approved by the EPA under conditional registration, and then we find out that it may not be good for the environment or good for bees. And I think that's a little backwards, and I think that's something that could really be improved upon. But the EPA is bound by policy on this. They're bound by,
right.
So it's kind of I think there could be better oversight and independence in how pesticides are and chemicals, fungicides and herbicides are approved and used in the environment.
So, the kind of the victims of this are the bees, the environment, all the wildlife around, and of course the beekeepers themselves.
Exactly.
And that doesn't have to happen. We can change that.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So listeners, it's not just about what you can do in your own yard, but it's how you advocate and how you vote to make change in these arenas. And putting pressure on big agriculture to do things differently. I'll just throw that 2 cents in there.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that I'm glad you brought up, is that there's not a lot of work in this particular political climate being done on the federal level to protect pollinators. In fact, there's been a sort of a backtrack, if you will, on some of the things. Some chemicals have been reapproved under this EPA that had been banned under the previous administration. However, there is work being done on a state level that is very important, and that's something that people can get involved in and make a difference in. New York has a Birds and Bees Protection Act is now. Vermont passed a law this year that prohibits household use of neonicotinoids, and there are 10 states that are doing legislation to study things on pollinator health. There are a bunch of states that have done work on protecting pollinators from pesticides, and then also there's legislative work done in I think half a dozen states to protect pollinator habitat. Mm-hmm. So all those things are really important for not only honeybees but for all the native bees and the birds associated with them.
And we can do so much on the municipal level and really put pressure, there. So listeners, take heed. Time to act.
Yeah.
Watch the movie and then act. And I should mention that, folks, you don't have to be a beekeeper to find this film fascinating. If you eat to survive, this is a film that's going to be important to see. And, we need to get people who have all sorts of backgrounds, like you demonstrate in your film, to get engaged on this, because it's not just a gardener or a landscaper's problem. It's not just a farmer's problem. It's not just a beekeeper's problem. It's all of our problem.
Totally right. And I sort of say that it's the important story that most people don't know they need to know, because it does affect every one of us. And as a subject matter, that's very exciting to me, because it's rare that you can have a subject in a film that affects literally 100% of the population, but this does. And so I'm so excited about that. But it's a subject that I think people they're actionable steps. It's a topic that almost everybody can do something about, and those things can be as simple as buying honey from a local beekeeper, or doing pollinator gardening in their yard, or even a window box. Small steps make big differences, and that's something that everybody can do. From education to, you can become a beekeeper if you're interested in it, or supporting your local agriculture, joining a CSA, or going to the farmer's market. All these things are differences that will make a difference, and it is a scalable. The solutions are scalable, and I think we have a tremendous opportunity to make a difference, and I'm so excited about that.
And, obviously staying pesticide free in our landscapes, and insisting that the vendors that we purchase anything from, the food that we eat, plants that we buy, are pesticide free.
Yep. Yeah.
And the disclosure is getting better, but we have a way to go with that, don't we?
Yeah, it's a bad time for bees right now, both honeybees and native bees, but I think it's a really interesting time, because so many people have an awareness that there is a problem with bees, and they don't know what it is, and they don't know if they can do something about it. And so, what I was trying to do with this was to try and explain what those problems are, but then also inspire people to take action and do something, because it is scalable solutions, and the problems, I think, are going to come from the bottom up. And the choices that you make when you go into a supermarket, and the choices that you buying American food, first of all, buying American honey, but also maybe organic, and then not using the pesticides, not using the herbicides in your own landscape, is so important. And the biggest compliment I've gotten is somebody who said, I started to relook at the way, when I go into the supermarket, relook at the food and think about where it came from, and who grew it, and how it was pollinated, and being able to change that focus is so exciting, because that's where the change is going to come from, and it's going to come from the bottom up.
And being willing to pay a little premium for that, because it costs more to do this, and it's okay, and that's okay.
Well, our food is cheap. Relative to much of the rest of the world, we have been very lucky to have a very cheap available food relative to many other places in the world.
Well, Peter, your film, The Pollinators, it's a beautiful, visually beautiful film. It's educational. It has a strong environmental message, and really encourage listeners to check it out. You can get more information at www.thepollinators.net. And follow Peter on @PollinatorsFilm on Twitter. And I'd just like to thank you so much for doing this. This was a 4-year effort, from what you told me.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thanks for all of that. And it's I just had to say I had so much fun doing it. It was a lot of work, but it was and a lot of bee stings along the way. But it was it was tremendous. These people, I came away with such great respect for these commercial beekeepers and their importance to our food system, and they're just amazing people that are just, they care about their bees like people care about their cattle or their sheep or whatever, and they're not pets, but they care about them, and they really are focused on trying to make it better. And it's a good time right now that I think we can really make some changes.
Well, thank you so much for working so hard to share this important story. And I hope you'll come back for another interview in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.